The second book of the 5 books of Moses, of the Chumash, Sefer SHMOS, we start this week. And Sefer SHMOS gets its name, SHMOS, because it's the second word of the first PARSHA, PARSHA SHMOS. Just like Bereshis is Bereshis and Vayikra B'Midbar Devarim. That's the titles we usually refer to them as. So some of the Sfarim have other names that they go by that are more effective, that are more descriptive than SHMOS or Bereshis. They actually tell you a little bit about what's in the book. And for Sefer SHMOS, the Netziv, among others, points out, I think it's originally Ramban, that the second book of the Torah is actually referred to as Sefer HaGeula, or the book of redemption, because the Jewish people go through it. Exodus and Mitzrayim, and then they go to redemption. In fact, the book of Exodus, as it's called in English, kind of speaks to that same idea. It's talking about the Mitzrayim experience as the center, or the theme of Sefer SHMOS. It's also known as Sefer Sheni. My wife pointed this out to me. From the Netziv, he points out that's called Sefer Sheni. So that sounds like it's obvious. Book number 2, right? But it's interesting that Sefer Bereshis is called Sefer Rishon, Sefer SHMOS is called Sefer Sheni, and that's it. There's no Sefer Shlishi, Sefer Rabbi, Sefer Chamishi. So even though they use that term to describe Volume 1 and Volume 2, they don't use that term, the numbering, to describe the other 3. So really, what that is driving at, the Netziv says, that's driving at the development of the Jewish people. And it's really the equivalent of saying volume, or Part A and Part B. That Sefer Bereshis and Sefer SHMOS are really 2 sides of the same story. That Bereshis is about the development of individuals, and SHMOS is about the development of the nation as a whole. So it's an important idea to keep in mind. But I want to suggest today, not that this is intended, but that at least coincidentally, Sefer SHMOS might actually be a great name for the second book of the Chumash. SHMOS meaning names. So if you look in source 1, if you have the sheets, there's still some extras going around. We can look on. So in source number 1, we have the first pasuk. Ve'ila Shemos b'nei Yisrael habayim Mitzrayma, Eis Yaakov ish uveso ba'u. These are the names of the children of Israel who are coming to Egypt with Jacob. Each man and his household came. So one thing that's worthy of noting in the first verse is the word habaim, that were coming. Habaim is in present tense, even though the Jewish people already came. And the rest of the pasuk is in past tense. Ishu veso ba'u, they came, but habaim Mitzrayim, that were coming right then. That's one thing to note. Another interesting thing, we're going to talk a little bit from the Baal HaTurim today, and we'll get back to it. He says, if you look at the Roshi Tevos, Shemos b'nei Yisrael habaim, the first letter of each word, and you put them all together. Shemos b'nei Yisrael habaim, Shin Beis Yod Hey, is Shivya, to be in captivity. Because it really is the beginning of the story of slavery, which just is an interesting idea. Rashi has a problem with this first pasuk. Really, this first series of psukim. We start the Sefer by saying these are the names, and then it's not on the sheet, but the psukim continue. Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Yisachar, Zvulun, goes through the whole list of the Shvatim, and each one in his household. So Rashi asks the question in source 2. Afal pi sheminan b'chayehen b'shmosan chazer umenan b'misasan. So Rashi refers to his question, which is why are they being counted again? We have a list of all of these, the Shivim Nefesh, all these people that came down to Mitzrayim at the end of Sefer Bereshis. So what do we have here? We have a second count, which seems to be unnecessary. So Rashi says, Lehodiach hibasan shenimshul lekochavim. The Jewish people are compared to stars, and a person counts the stars because he thinks they're so beautiful and so precious, and God thought the Jewish people were precious, so he doesn't just count them once, but he counts them a second time, etc. That's source number 2. So that's one approach. One approach is to say that the reason that the Bnei Yisrael are counted a second time is God wants to show them how dear the people are to Him. But if you look in the Baal HaTurim in source number 3, the Baal HaTurim is going to say something unbelievable. Eila Shemos Bnei Yisrael habaim, Rashi Tevos Shivya, like we said before. Why? Shafilu kishahayu b'shivya, Shemos Bnei Yisrael shaloshinu Shemosa. Eila Shemos Bnei Yisrael is not for the purpose of counting the Jewish people, but to point out that they maintained their Jewish names even while they were in captivity. Vizehu she'amru Chazal, and this is what our sages taught us. Bishvil shlosha dvarim nigalu miMitzrayim. 3 reasons the Jewish people were redeemed from Egypt. Bishvil shaloshinu shemosam, because they didn't change their names. Would anybody care to add the other 2? And yes, this is a trick question. Names, clothes. Number 3?
Wasn't language?
Language. That's the one that everybody talks about. If you can find that in print, in an original source, this I will say a lot of this year comes from discussion that we had at the Kollel this week, our Kollel in Clinton Park. And I walked into this discussion with the same assumption, and I saw this Baal HaTurim, and I said, you see, those are the 3 things that he's talking about. And nowhere in print have we found it.
So does the actual Baal HaTurim end ...
He does not list the other 2, yes.
Just like that.
He does not list the other 2. So that is already troubling. What is more troubling, and we'll get back to it, in source 4, in the bold words, you see B'Shvil Daled Dvarim. The source in the Medrash is actually in Sefer Vayikra, and it counts 4, not 3. But everyone knows the 3. Rav Usher Weiss, who is one of the a Rav of a city in Eretz Yisrael, so he has an essay that one of my friends in the Kollel was telling me about, where he quotes this Medrash, B'Shvil Shlosha Dvarim. He doesn't quote a source. He just writes the Medrash, so everyone knows the Medrash. He just wrote it out, and he goes on to a whole theory about it. If you look in the Pirkei Rebbe Elazar, which is the Medrash type work that the Baal HaTurim is referring to, he does not quote those 3. And if you look in the Medrash in Vayikra, he quotes 4. So if anybody can tell me where that comes from, it would be great. Rav Kasher is one of the rabbis who spent a lot of time studying the history of Medrash. And he compiled this massive work. It must be like 30 volumes. Bigger than a full set of Gemaras on the study of Medrash. Every Medrash, every version. And he apparently writes, I did not see this inside, but he apparently writes that this must be a Medrash that we don't have. Because he's studying Medrash, and every book you read with Midrashim quotes 3 things the Jewish people got that got them out of Mitzrayim. And he, the author of this big work, the expert on Medrash, says, I can't find it. It must have disappeared. So if anyone can find the authentic source for that, whatever Westmount gives out for prizes, that's what you'll get. I don't know. Not coming from me. But, I don't know. So, we'll get back to the Medrash in a second. But the Baal HaTurim says, he answers that question, why are the Jewish people being counted a second time? So he says the reason they're being counted a second time is not because we don't know who they are, but to emphasize even while they were in Egypt, they were maintaining those names. Look at the second paragraph in source 3. V'gamkein ve'ele SHMOS. Now he has another issue. What's the Vav? The letter Vav usually means and. So you don't start a book with the word and. So what must it be doing? Mosif al inyan rishon. What does that mean? It means it's going back on referring to something that occurred before. Everyone came to the shiur and they had a great time. I hope. But it has to be going on something. You can't have the end of the second clause in the sentence without the verse. So what is ve'ele SHMOS? And these are the names. What's it continuing from? So the Baal HaTurim says, Vav Mosef al inyan rishon, Vayamas Yosef ve'ele SHMOS. Yosef dies, ... and these are the names of Jewish people. Okay, why is that? Shetziva lahem shelo yeshanu shemosam. Yosef is the one who commands the Jewish people not to change their names. Ve'amar lahem, and he said, Af al pi sheshinu shemi, the koronosi tzafnas paneach, even though they changed my name, Paro calls me tzafnas paneach. When people say, who is that guy? They say, my Egyptian name. Atem al tishanu shmosechem. Has anyone heard this before? You don't change your name, says the Baal HaTurim. It's a reference to Yosef. Yosef gets the credit. Why would Yosef feel the need to tell them not to do this? Because he himself walked around with an Egyptian name.
But Tafnat is a Hebrew letter.
Is it?
It's Egyptian. Tafnat from Paneach, goes. It's used in Hebrew.
Rashi says on Safnas Paneach, in the Parsha over there, Rashi says there is no other word in Chumash like this. Not a single other word.
It's came to Hebrew, now it's used in Hebrew.
Rashi.
Both.
We know
It came-
somebody whose name is Tzafra.
No.
So it's interesting. And the name Moshe is a Hebrew name?
Exactly. Moshe, you would think.
It's also.
So there's a big machlokus about that.
I will draw him.
Right, so Min Hamayim Ishisiyu. So who spoke Hebrew? Paro's daughter. Where did she learn Hebrew from? Yosef, when he pretended to be an Egyptian, couldn't speak Hebrew because he would give his identity away to his brothers. But Paro's daughter
He needed a
is an
chance.
excellent Hebrew linguist.
I don't know. The paneach is also a
Paneach is also very strange. Rashi says
the
that.
verb and all used in
Right.
notice.
So Rashi says Ksafnat comes milashon ksafun, something that's hidden.
Yeah.
And he says Yosef is the one who is Megaleh. Yosef is the one who reveals the hidden dreams, the hidden interpretation of Paro's dreams.
So Safun.
Safun could be Hebrew, maybe. Again, how Paro would know that name to call Yosef that is a good question. Maybe Paro called him the equivalent in
Maybe.
Egyptian and the Torah is translating it to Hebrew. That's what some of the Mefarshim say about Moshe. The Barbanel maybe or Ibn Ezra, somebody says that. That it was Moshe's name was not Moshe. People didn't call him that. They called him the Egyptian equivalent.
Or maybe the Egyptian language had a
Close.
certain dialect.
I saw interestingly, I mean this will come up later, that one of the things these Jewish people used to keep their identity was their Lashon, and they are referred to as Ivrim. And that's one of the things, Ivrim and Ivrit, that was their language, that's how they were identified. But this is very interesting because let's take a look at source number 4, and we'll see one version of what got the Jewish people out of Mitzrayim, and you'll see it's a little bit different than what we're familiar with. And this is the Medrash in Sefer Vayikra. Rav Huna Amar b'Shem Bar Kafra B'Shvil Dalid Dvar Niglu Yisrael. For 4 things. There are 4 reasons why the Jewish people were taken out of Mitzrayim. Sheloshinu SHMOT, they didn't change their names. Ve'as Lashonam, and their language. V'lo Amru Lashon Hara. V'lo Nimtza B'neihem Echad Mehen Paretz Be'erva. Anybody heard those last 2 before?
I didn't speak her, but I did hear about that there was no immorality.
So interesting, immorality is also credited to Yosef.
Right.
Yosef is the one who conquers his desire to sleep with the wife of Potiphar, and that's also a message maybe that he passes on to the people. Yosef gets a lot of credit. We don't talk about Yosef's
Well-deserved.
relationship. Well-deserved credit.
Well-deserved.
Yosef HaTzadik, as per our previous discussions. But Lashon Hara too. So Lashon Hara is interesting also. The Medrash continues. We don't have it here on the pages, but explains where they get that from. But this is just interesting because this version is not the version that we're familiar with. They didn't speak Lashon Hara, etc., etc. But it's definitely it's worth thinking about. That's for sure. And what's interesting here is that we're starting to see the picture that maybe the names in this context, the names of the Jewish people. It's not Sefer SHMOS isn't just about, it starts with that word of SHMOS, but names themselves, the value of keeping their Jewish names was part of the reason they got out of Mitzrayim, even in this version of the Medrash. It's an interesting idea. We'll have to maybe discuss why that was. So there is a great tshuva from Rav Moshe Feinstein. See, we're running through this. It's a short sheet tonight, and we're going to run through the whole thing at the beginning. The rest of it's going to come from this pile over here. But Rav Moshe Feinstein got a letter, as he often did, from a student. He addresses him as Avrech Echad, a certain student, Kol guy or whatever, whose wife was expecting a baby girl, and he was planning on naming after his mother, who had passed away at a young age. And he wanted to know if it was appropriate to name after his mother, considering that his mother had a non-Jewish name. So he writes to Rav Moshe and he says, what should I do? So Rav Moshe goes on a pretty long discussion about the importance of Kibbud Avim and naming after parents, etc., etc. And he reassures the guy that he should name after her, and he says, but she died at a young age, so add a second name that would kind of be a schus for the baby. But I forgot what the name was, Gidol maybe, so Gidol Chaya, something like that, to add a second name, so that it would be a schus, but he should use the name. And Rav Moshe says, obviously what you're getting at here is this Medrash in PARSHA SHMOS, that if this is such a tremendous thing that the Jewish people got out of Mitzrayim, because they didn't change their names, they kept their Jewish names, So how can I go along and name my baby a name that's not Jewish? So one of my Rabbeim was asked this question when I was in YU. If this medrash about the three things, the clothes and the language and the names, was halachically binding, do you have to keep to this medrash? So he thought that you did. I remember this Rabbi of ours, he said that the medrash is absolutely binding. These are important objective values. So what he said, what does that mean practically? So his take was interesting. He said, names doesn't mean you have to name your kid something Yiddish that's impossible to pronounce, that's clearly like a Yiddish name. He said it means like a biblical name. You can name your son Jonathan or Sammy or whatever. That's part of, we're not naming our kids Christopher or Matthew or things like that. He said it's not an extreme opinion. He said, what does it mean to dress like a Jew? He says it doesn't mean to dress like a chassid per se. He said they're not dressing Jewish either. They're just dressing like they're from the 1750s, which is to a certain extent true. It's not Jewish clothing. He says it means to dress like a mensch. That you shouldn't walk out with words written all over your sweatshirts.
Does it mean that they are not dressed like a mensch?
No, that's not what I meant at all. I was saying you don't have to go to that extreme for whatever reason. But he was saying to not think that it's appropriate to walk around with clothes that you bought ripped or things like that. That was his opinion. And the same thing he said. Language was a little bit more tricky. He said to use words that we're familiar with, to use words from the Torah when we speak. To not be afraid to use Hebrew or a word with a Jewish connotation. But he says it doesn't mean that we have to speak Hebrew or Yiddish all the time and dress like something specific. It was driving at a more basic idea. So that's one approach. So if Moshe gets into this discussion here in the tshuva, which he normally doesn't do, it's tshuva, so we're usually more halachically focused. And here Moshe addresses this medrash, and he says, so how do we grapple with this, balance this medrash with what people are doing? So let's take a look at source 5. He says, this that the rabbis praised Begalus Mitzrayim, that when it came to life in Egypt, Shaloshinu SHMOS, Hu lekodem matan Torah, Shalo haya heker gadol, Bishvel kiyum hamitzvos lebnei Noach. How many mitzvos did the Jewish people have in Egypt, says Rav Moshe? 7. Just like everyone else in the world. Right, bnei Noach. So they had 7 mitzvos. So he said that doesn't define us as a people if we're just doing what everybody else is doing. Ubeprat, and this is an unfortunately strong accusation, shechelek gadol miyisrael avdu gam kim avodah zarah. Yerubam lo malu es b'neihem ad samach lahagula kishahayu tzrichim lechol pesach shemolo san Yoshua. We know historically that they weren't, a large group of the Jewish people was not practicing circumcision, for example. We know that a large group of the Jewish people, maybe a very large percentage, was worshipping idols during the slavery in Egypt. So not only were they not unique for practicing, if they did practice the 7 mitzvos b'nei Noach, but they weren't really doing that much right either. So what's he driving at? L'chein, b'shvel ha'emuna sheyigalu, they had a faith that they would be redeemed, a belief. V'ratu sheyiyu nikarim shehem Yisrael, and they wanted it to be recognizable that they were Jewish. In other words, they wanted God to see them when He came flying over in His plane. That He wanted to be able to pick out who was Jewish. Hinhigu, they became accustomed. Lahakpid shlo yishanu es shmosam v'lo yishanu es lashonam. They started to practice this idea. They came up with it on their own. They said, we want to be identified as Jewish because we want to get out of here. And if we want to get out of here, God has to recognize us. It's interesting because that's one of the issues that comes up during the Maklos. Maybe we'll get to that in a couple of weeks. With the blood on the doorposts, God doesn't know who they are and which people were serving Avodah Zarah, etc. What's so special that they decided we're only going to use Jewish names? What's so special that they decided we're going to dress Jewish? It's not the behavior, it's the motivation behind it. What was the motivation to do this? The motivation was they wanted to look Jewish. And they had no other way to do it. So if you have no other way to do it, and they're doing this so that, because they know God is coming, it's just a question of when. So they want to be ready. So they keep that identity going. So that was a big deal for them. Aval, says Rav Moshe, but Achar Matan Torah, here in Hebrew it's in the bold, Ein lanu chiyuv midina v'gam lo me'inyani zehirus u'musar. There is no idea whatsoever from a strictly legal perspective or from a perspective of inyani zehirus u'musar. There's no Inyan at all. That's what he says. Elo mashten etztavinu hataryag mitzvos ledoros. Does the Torah say name your kids Jewish? Does the Torah say dress like a Jew? Never. Not a mitzvah. Ukifi shenemru b'Torah shebal peh. Moshe obviously qualifies that. That's not just what's written in the Torah. There's Torah shebal peh. V'lachein lo ekpidu al zer raboseinu. He's referring to an earlier part in the Tshuva where he points out to this person who wrote him the letter that there are tons of scholars throughout the generations whose books we read every day who didn't have Jewish names. One of his classic examples is the Rambam. He's Rav Moshe ben Maimon. Maimon is not a Jewish name. And the Gemara is full of names, Aramaic names. The status of the Lashon of Aramaic is already questionable. Aramaic has a certain higher standard than other languages, but even that being true, they're not Jewish names.
Even many of the children of the Torah tribes, they didn't have Jewish names. When you look at the names,
What do you mean?
they don't sound Jewish. Children of the brothers, Yehuda.
Oh, the children of the
Reuben,
Shvatim.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And some of them don't. The names don't sound Jewish
But
at
according
all.
to this, they were.
Yeah, but they don't sound Jewish at all.
So yeah, it's also, this is something that they picked up while they were in Egypt. Kids that were named in the first 70, not necessarily. Well, you have to know, what does it mean to have a Jewish name history at the time that they were in Mitzrayim? What does a Jewish name mean? But okay. The Medrash does give examples. What Reuben would be in Egyptian, what Shimon would be in Egyptian. They didn't switch it over, so to speak. But he just finishes up with K'fi she'namarnu Torah shebal peh. Teha'afen yani zehirus u'musar u'mayla nami nemru misinai. Moshe references to a comment of the Bar Tanura on Pirkei Avos here, where he says even these Pirkei Avos like ideas of Musar were given over at Har Sinai, according to the Bar Tanura. And there's no Mishnah. Keep your Jewish name. There's no mitzvah. Wear Jewish clothes. It doesn't exist. Ella, he says, Shebizchuz zeh niglu avuseinu. It was in this merit that they were redeemed. She'efshar lefari shehaya maila v'davar tov rak etzlam. This was an admirable trait specifically for them. V'lo achar matan Torah. So not only is Rav Moshe veering off into philosophical issues, which he normally doesn't, but he says a radical new approach to this medrash. Don't worry about that medrash. Don't worry about Jewish names and about Jewish clothes and about speaking Hebrew or speaking in a Jewish manner. That doesn't matter. What identifies you as Jewish? If someone says to you, how do you know that that person is Jewish? What should you answer? You see he eats kosher. You see the guy davens in the morning. You see the way he doesn't speak Lashon Hara, maybe. He wears a yarmulke, that's what makes him Jewish. That's not what makes us Jewish. That's what makes us look Jewish. We should be identified by our behavior. The problem is they didn't have a Torah to identify with. So for them they had to come up with something on their own. And they came up with something external, something physical. Something that the people, or eventually God, could point to and say, oh, I'm taking him out, I'm taking her out. But for us, we have better options. Don't worry about the names. And Rav Moshe says, even though this is possible, it's difficult to state without great proof. Rav Moshe basically says he acknowledges that this is a novel approach to the Medrash, so he's a little bit hesitant at the end, but he says Rav Moshe has the halakhic authority to say there's no legal basis for demanding that people keep Jewish names, which is an interesting thing. I don't know if people are aware of that. But that's what Rav Moshe says. Now, in our conversations at the Kollel this week, Rabbi Nathaniel Javasky pointed out to me that Rav Moshe says, I wish there was basis for this argument, because he's never heard it before, but it appears in the Maharal. People have heard of the Maharal of Prague. So the Maharal of Prague quotes this medrash, and he says almost the exact same thing as Rav Moshe Feinstein a few hundred years before. The only difference I saw in reading the Maharal's approach or Moshe Feinstein's approach is that he's not so focused per se on Kabbalas HaTorah. That when you have mitzvos, when you have Torah commandments, that identifies you versus picking up Jewish traditions on your own. He focuses on the status of a nation. And the Jewish people go down to Mitzrayim, they're individuals. They happen to be related by family, but they're not identified as a Jewish people. But when God takes them out of Egypt, He says, V'yisem li le'am. Then you will be for me a nation. So what were you before then? Something tribal, a bunch of family members, but as families get bigger, so they separate. He says, then they became Jewish. They became part of a nation. The nation that went through that redemption from Egypt, that's what identified them. Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am Hashem your God, Asher Hotzeisicha me'aretz Mitzrayim. Right? That's what identifies us. We're the people that were saved, the nation that was taken out from within a nation. But he basically is driving at the same point, and he says that it was significant for them because they had nothing else to attach themselves to. They didn't have the nation to attach themselves to. Now, luckily the Maharal continues, and he talks about the significance of these four things. The Maharal actually quotes the version of the Medrash that you have in front of you, that these four ideas. And he has a very interesting breakdown of Jewish identity. The Maharal says, if you have, just as a mashal, if you have a house built of bricks and wood, eitzim v'avanim, stones and wood, he says, how do you describe that house? He said there are four means of description. There are the stones, there's the wood, then there's the house as a whole, and then there's the neighborhood the house is in. What role the house plays in the neighborhood. It's one of the houses on the block. So really four aspects of the description of the house. So the Maharal says that the Jewish person is the exact same way. He has his guf, he has his physical body, has his neshama, his soul. He has the combination, which is the person, which person can't be complete without both halves. And then he has his role within the Jewish people. The exact same idea. And the Maharal says these four reasons for the redemption relate to these four aspects or perspectives on the human being. And he goes through. So we have these four things. Shaloshinu Eshmam Lashonam Lashon Hara V'lo Nimtza B'neihem Paratz Be'erva. He says when it comes to adultery, when it comes to adultery, he says that refers to the physical body. They kept their physical bodies pure from doing physical actions that they shouldn't. When it comes to Lashon Hara, he says that comes from the soul. Speech comes from our soul. And he made sure that their souls were pure. Shemam, they kept their names. He says that's the person. I am David Zirkind. I am a combination of my body and my soul. And they kept that pure as well. And finally he says, Loshinu es Lashonam, they kept their address on the block by speaking the same language as everybody else. A really beautiful idea, that this medrash is actually four components, and the four of them relate to these four different aspects of how you identify the Jew. And in all four ways, so that my soul appears Jewish, so that my body appears Jewish. So myself as a person appears to be Jewish, and so that I look Jewish within the people, so to speak.
So to me it sounds like awesome, like they were really very moral and pure people. So why does it say that they were on the 49th level of impurity?
So it's interesting because Rav Moshe Feinstein also gives them a lot of credit on the one hand, and he says they did these things and this was great and admirable and they came up with it on their own, and at the same time he says they weren't doing the basics when it came to religious practice. How they chose these things. Names and language are not particularly spiritual or impressive in that sense. They're important. And they felt the need, or Moshe's focused on these things being significant not because of their objective value, but because of the motivation behind them, which was the belief that God was going to take them out. Now granted, when it comes to Lashon Hara, you have something that's a little bit more impressive, religiously speaking, and obviously when it comes to adultery, the fact that they felt to keep that moral or ethical code or standard high. So that's also admirable, but that's not really the focus. And even if you want to give them credit when it comes to immorality, how do you explain the fact that a majority of the Jewish people were worshipping idols from a religious perspective?
Well, it is possible that
that was not handed down to them from one generation, so they got only what was given to them from their parents before.
It's actually interesting. I mean, it's like maybe what you're saying is that, you know, Yosef was worried about things like his Hebrew name. He saw that they tried to change his Hebrew name. He saw that they tried, you know, what it was like when they put him in this, you know, Egyptian garb, and he felt so uncomfortable. But maybe it never occurred to him
To tell them the basics, because he figured they know that.
Who would worship idols? How would Yosef imagine that his children would worship? Maybe that's a very interesting idea. That maybe it never even occurred to him to give that over.
Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I think there was a lot of influence of Egyptian and here also SHMOT means Abayim, it's continuation from last parasha. Abayim is meaning this continually Jacob heritage, but then somehow they started to get mixed in Egyptian life. They started to be influenced by that.
That's a beautiful read on the pasuk, Habaim, that at the beginning there was still continuity, and then Bo, that was a long time ago.
Bo
was a long time ago.
Jacob heritage, but they started to be mixed in Egyptian, and influence is starting to show up.
Right. It's interesting also in terms of the Yosef comment. So, which things did Yosef feel responsible to say? Which things did Yosef not feel responsible to point out or to encourage? Also, you have to look at this in context. What was Yosef dealing with after Yaakov dies? The brothers come back and they say, okay, now he's really going to get us. You know, they weren't so secure at all, and Yosef tries to prove his loyalty to the family, which we spoke about in the past. Maybe this Baal Turim specifically says to me, hey, Yosef maybe has ulterior motives here also. He's not just saying keep your names, Jewish names are important, but he's also saying I'm still Yosef behind the whole persona being the Egyptian leader, which is interesting. But here, obviously, in this presentation, the point of he was looking more towards the future, and again, the connection with adultery is also very interesting.
Rabbi McCall was saying this week, and I don't know if there's a source to it or just he was saying that although everybody referred to him as Safna Paneach, when anybody would say to him, "What's your name?" he himself always said Yosef.
Very interesting.
That was something that he just never, he allowed them to do it, but he never himself referred to himself as anything but Yosef.
Very interesting. So I think this is all. It's all good. So Moshe Feinstein's approach here really makes you think, and it also it's worth noting if you want to talk about how could they be on the 49th level of Tumah and still have these quality attributes, that also kind of highlights the effect that having a Torah has, and the following the Torah has the ability to kind of elevate them above that.
Also 80% faith.
Right, but Chamushim, that only 20%, 1/5 went out, which is an astonishing number. That's for sure.
Saying that they were waiting for the Geulah.
Right, or how many of them were actually waiting? You know, my Chavrusa said to me today, we'll get to something else that he said to me, but he's working on this notion of Shifra and Pua, going back to the names, whether they're Jewish names or not Jewish names. So that's interesting. So we always assume, I think, Shifra and Pua are Yocheved and Miriam, right? So Yocheved and Miriam. So what are these names? So they had Egyptian names also. Why they had names for work or something like that. So there is an approach that they were Egyptian women, which I don't know if people are familiar with that. There's another approach in the Rishonim, in the commentaries on the Chumash, that they were Egyptians. It wasn't Miriam and Yocheved.
Shifra and Pua were Egyptian women. It wasn't.
After all, they're such Egyptian names, so we're common with the approach that was their name at work, but they had Jewish names at home.
I thought I remember the Shifra and Pua were rather references, because there's this whole thing about how at the beginning of the Parsha, and this is a totally different thing, but it's called SHMOS, and we're talking about SHMOS, but then there's this whole long section where no one is referred to by their name. There's somebody from Levi who marries a woman from Levi, and there's Bas Paro, and there's Melech Mitzrayim, and Achod, nobody is referred to. So Shifra and Pua, we always heard it had to do with, like, if it's Miriam, that she used to say, like she used to make sounds, kind of cooing sounds to calm the baby down.
So my Charush just pointed out to me, you would think that if it's Jewish women, it's such an inspiring story, the way that they fought back against Paro, and they, and he said, think about it from the other perspective, that these were Egyptian women in a culture where it was perfectly legitimate to enslave Jewish people, to treat them the way that they were treated. And not only that, but Paro comes to them and he says, this is your job, you don't disobey Paro. But they knew inside that they couldn't do it. It's actually an unbelievably inspiring story from that perspective also, which is something to think about.
I'm sorry, the last one. So the Shifra and Pur were Miriam and Yocheved?
The two different approaches. It's not so clear.
What does their midrash say?
So the medrash, the medrash that most people are familiar with is the one that says that it was Miriam and Yocheved. But I think you have to find the source. But there are other sources that don't say that, because if they were Miriam and Yocheved, they would go by Miriam and Yocheved. Again, aside from the fact that maybe we're not addressing people by name in PARSHA SHMOS, which is a different discussion. But the two different valid approaches to who they were.
Even Batya sounds Jewish, doesn't it?
We have to wonder also, is Badya a translation of an Egyptian?
That's it.
Is Badya referring to a daughter of Hashem?
Batya?
Or is it referring to...
after she converted, because there was a certain...
Or after she converted, right. Right. So, I think when people talk about names, there are a lot of famous notions about names in Judaism. Parents name a child, they have some kind of prophetic vision or whatever, that they name their kid with prophecy. Someone pointed out to me this week, Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, who we often quote in this year, says that Shem has the same root letters as Neshama, that Shem is supposed to hit the soul of the person, and Shem and Sham are the same letters. When parents name a child, they're not naming him for what the child is now, they're naming him for what he's going to be over there, he's going to be in the future. These are, I think, one idea or the other, some are more famous than others, but the idea is similar. We all think the name of a person drives at their essence. So I want to share a completely opposite approach to the notion of names that, follow me, is going to be a little bit counterintuitive, it might seem a little weird, but it's going to develop very nicely. And it comes from the Lubavitch Rebbe. And the Lubavitch Rebbe explains this really unique idea that he credits to Hasidus. I don't know what his sources are, but he says there's a Hasidic tradition that takes the exact opposite approach to names. What is a name? Says the Lubavitch Rebbe. Well, a name is what describes me. My name is David, so that tells you something, right? So he says, who gives you your name? You don't get to pick it. Who uses your name? Everybody else. So we think, the name of a person, parents give themselves a lot of credit. We know who our child's going to be, but that's classic. But the kid has no say. He says the name is actually something that appears to be who we are, and it's the farthest thing from it. Our name is really our perception in the world. It has nothing to do with us. So very fascinating. And the Lubavitch Rebbe says that this is the exact same relationship between the body and the soul. He says, who is that person? So you can point, you see, that's him right there. But that's only a minor shareholder in your existence. You have your body, but you have your soul. Where's your connection? Your neshamas, your ruach mamalo, your connection to God. That's who you're all about. Interesting, Adam, the name Adam, comes afar min ha'adamah. Right? So a person is named for his physical, man is named for his physical body, not for his soul. So the Radak points out in Sefer Bereshis, that's because if you would talk about human beings from a religious perspective, the part that you would forget about is the physical part. It's our soul, it's our connection to God, it's our performance of mitzvahs. Well, who cares about what he looks like? Who cares where he comes from? So he says they called him Adam because you should also know he has a physical component. Our physical bodies are a minor player in our religious lives. It's our soul that's the major player. So people look at your body and they say, hey, this is who he is, but that's really not him at all. That's how other people perceive us. When people want to get our attention, they call to our ears. They attract us with our eyes, but that's not who we are. The exact same relationship. And says Lubavitch Rebbe something unbelievable. Ve'ela SHMOS b'nei Yisrael habayim Mitzrayma, he says the Jewish people are not enslaved. You cannot enslave the soul of a Jew. Eila SHMOS b'nei Yisrael habayim, these are the names of the people. The names were enslaved and not the bodies themselves. A Hasidic interpretation of this pasuk. Shemot b'nei Yisrael habayim, the names of the Jewish people went down into slavery, but the Jewish people themselves were not enslaved. I hope that's clear. The SHMOS were in slavery and not the individuals. And what is the shame? The shame is what people point at. The shame is what people call it, but the shame is not the person. The person is always connected to God in heaven. The body is there for whatever reason. I was reading this piece and I thought this was fabulous. And I thought this is a tremendous, I don't want to say tactic, because that definitely devalues it, but it's a tremendously positive approach to dealing with suffering, to dealing with slavery, to dealing with persecution. To say that we are not enslaved. It's part of us that's there. Part of us is suffering, but part of us can never be taken away. And I credit my Chavusa for leaning me towards this, but this is exactly, more or less, Viktor Frankl's theory in Man's Search for Meaning. People familiar with this book?
Yeah.
So, I was not familiar with this book until very recently, and I was reading through a lot of it as quickly as possible. And I'll just read you maybe a short passage from what Viktor Frankl says, and it's, I think, driving the exact same message that the Rabbi writes over here. And as I guess means of introduction for anyone who's not familiar, Viktor Frankl was a psychotherapist before the Holocaust, and a Jewish psychotherapist who was taken and put in Auschwitz. And he writes, he was in the process of writing a lot of his psychological theory when he was taken by the Nazis, and he continued to write and continued to analyze during the war, and he came out to publish, and a lot of his theories are taken from his experiences in the war. And this book, Man's Search for Meaning, the first half is about his experience in the war and what he saw and how he felt when things were happening, and the second half is of the book is really all about what he calls logotherapy, which is his theory of searching for meaning. So he tells an unbelievable story in the book, that when he was first taken by the Nazis, he was working on a manuscript, and he took it with him. He had it hidden in his coat pocket or whatever, and as soon as he got to Auschwitz, they stripped him of his clothes and they put him in workman's clothes, whatever they gave him, and they took his manuscript with them. And he had lost his family, and he said this was his child, this was what he was working on, this is what he was dedicated to, and they just took it away and he would never get it again. He was miserable. And they gave him a set of standard clothes, which he says came from someone who was just killed in the gas chambers. And you can imagine that experience, or you can try to. And he says he felt in the pocket that there was something in the pocket of the clothing he got. And he pulled it out, and there was a piece of paper that said Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad on it, which is just unbelievable. Unbelievable story. So, in this chapter, he writes about, he compares himself in a lot of ways to Freudian psychology. And he talks about how in Freudian psychology everything works backwards. Things that happen to you as a child shape who you are for the future. And in some ways, even though he is like a psychotherapist, he views his theories as exactly the opposite. Never looking on what was in the past, but always looking for meaning in the future. And that's really how he differentiates himself from those Freudian psychologists. So he says here something really great. In this section is called The Meaning of Suffering. So he says, let me just find it. We must never forget that we may also find meaning in life even when confronted with a hopeless situation. His goal, of course, is to say that we should be searching for meaning. So he says, even when we find ourselves in hopeless situations, which he found himself, it doesn't mean we have to give up. When facing a fate that cannot be changed, for what then matters is to bear witness to the uniquely human potential at its best, which is to transform a personal tragedy into triumph, to turn one predicament into a human achievement. When we are no longer able to change the situation, just think of an incurable disease such as cancer. We're challenged to challenge ourselves. Very interesting. He says, let me find the line. There are situations in which one is cut off from the opportunity to do one's work or to enjoy one's life. But what never can be ruled out is the unavoidability of suffering. In accepting this challenge to suffer bravely, life has a meaning up till the last moment, and it retains this meaning literally to the end. In other words, life's meaning is an unconditional one, for it even includes the potential meaning of an unavoidable suffering. Hear this from a Holocaust survivor. And he says, when you're searching for meaning, nothing can take that away from you. They can take your body, but you find meaning in every situation that you're in. If you set your goals for success and experiencing what he calls liberty, experiencing freedom and riches and wealth and success in physical terms, so then that can be taken away from you. And if that's what your happiness is contingent on, then you won't be happy. But if you get your happiness from meaning, from searching for meaning, if that's your goal, then you can search for meaning wherever you are. And he says that's something that can never be taken away. And I think that is exactly what the Lubavitcher Rebbe was. I wonder if the Lubavitcher Rebbe was familiar with this book.
Yes.
The Lubavitcher Rebbe also, he was?
Yes. Then at the end, a little story that I read, but I don't want to interrupt now. So.
Okay, so that one will make the video. But I assume that this is the exact same idea. I'm reading into it maybe a little bit from what the Rebbe says, but it's unbelievable that somebody showed it to me just yesterday, because it's the exact same idea. SHMOS b'nei Yisrael habayim, the guf, the physical body of the Jewish people, is enslaved in Sefer SHMOS. But it's interesting from this perspective. SHMOS, the names are enslaved, but not the people. And their connection, the way the Rebbe speaks about it, the neshama of the Jewish person is always connected to God in heaven, and that can never be taken away. It's only the body, the physical body, that's enslaved. And I just wanted to say on that note that if we look back at this context, both the approach of the Medrash, which we said from Rav Moshe Feinstein, and this approach of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, SHMOS play a major theme in the entire experience in Egypt. Whether it's the way the Jewish people clung on to their faith by finding means of identifying themselves, even if those aren't permanent, but they found ways to identify themselves so that they would be uniquely Jewish throughout their experience, that is an important theme throughout the entire time in Mitzrayim. That's one unbelievable theme. And a second is one that if they had that emunah that Rav Moshe speaks of, how did they keep that emunah? And I think that's exactly where the Lubavitcher Rebbe's approach fits in. That they recognized that their physical enslavement wasn't going to dictate the meaning of their lives. And if they kept that hope, they kept that meaning, that's what inspired them to come up with these ways of identifying themselves, because they always knew that God was going to be there. And we'll stop with that.